Hey everybody and welcome to another video. This was inspired by a video Midwinter Minis did a little while back on how to paint yellow armour. It's been in the back of my mind to do something similar with white armour since I've seen that video. The link to Guy's video is in the top right, and if you haven't seen it already, it's almost certainly better than this one. If you're sticking with me, I'm going to show you two methods of painting white on this lovely little Terminator captain. The first step with painting any white is to start with grey. If you start with pure white, you've given yourself nowhere to go in terms of highlights. So I'm starting with Citadel's Grey Sear, which is a really nice smooth base coat. It's very pricey and there are some other options out there, but this is the one I use for all my white scars. As you can see, even though the model was blue previously, it's now a nice flat grey colour, which is a perfect base coat and gives us a really nice place to start from. I grabbed some contrast Griff Charger Grey, and this is going to be our first shadow. I'm thinning this down to a glaze consistency, so probably 2 or 3 parts water to 1 part paint, and brushing that into the shadows. The first method of painting white I'm going to be showing you is a slightly more intensive method, and the second one is going to be a lot easier, and the one I usually use for my white scars. The key thing whenever you're painting white is to just take your time and be patient, and don't worry if it looks a little bit odd to start with. When you start adding in the extra colours later on, things won't look quite so stark. As you'll see as I go along, things start to look a little bit messy, but by the end it's going to look nice, neat and tidy. If you're trying to shade using this method, you want to be pulling the paint down towards the darker recesses, or those areas where light won't reach quite as well, and you'll end up with something similar to this. The next step is to then tidy up those blends between our base coat and our new shades, and for that I'm using Grey Sear straight out the pot. It's another reason I like using the Grey Sear paint from the rattle can, is that they have a standalone version you can use to tidy up later on. Once you're happy with those transitions, you can move on with a brighter highlight. I'm using AK Silver Grey and creating quite a chunky edge highlight. In some areas I'm actually essentially doing another base coat, but towards the top of the model. As you can see, I'm creating a really bright highlight here as a lot of the leg is facing towards the sky. You can also achieve a really similar effect with an airbrush. Honestly, the transition is probably going to be smoother, but I wanted to show that you can absolutely do this just with brushes. Next up is a slight hack. I'm using panel liner from Tamiya. This is an enamel paint and it applies really well over gloss varnish. So for once, for anyone who's watched this channel many times, I've actually gloss varnished the Mini. Once again with a brush, though using an airbrush or a rattle can is also equally fast. By applying the gloss varnish, we've increased the surface tension all over the Mini. That means enamel paints like this will run freely into the recesses. There are a few areas where it's a little bit messy, but don't worry, we can always come back in and tidy up once we've dried everything off. Enamel paints actually dry very quickly like acrylics. If you're using something like an oil paint here, you're going to have to wait quite some time, but you can still tidy up after the fact. Another method you can use is standard black lining using acrylic paints, and there's a link in the top right to show you a Salamanders video where I did exactly that. The con is that it's more time consuming, but the pro is that you have much more control over the brush, so it's entirely up to you how you want to add this recess step, but contrast is always key. Once everything was dry, I removed the gloss effect with a matte varnish. It's also worth noting that the panel liner has a glossy effect even if you didn't apply a gloss varnish beforehand, so a matte varnish after is always recommended. Now all the dirty stuff is done, we can move on to a nice clean bright white highlight. I'm using standard artist grade white here. It's quite a cheap tube from Hobbycraft or any other hobby store you can think of. Generally I find this is better white than a lot of the mini paints you can get, so just grab a tube of this, it will last you forever. As this is a slightly more time intensive paint job, I'm being careful with my edge highlighting. The good thing about this step too is that if you do have any slight spillovers that aren't massive from your previous steps, the edge highlighting will cover it up and it kills 2 birds with 1 stone. As you're painting your own model, you might feel like I did in that there wasn't enough going on and you weren't too pleased with the paint job. But the next steps will really help this pop, and there's something you're going to do on every model. It's adding other colours. As I've been saying throughout the video, contrast is key, especially with white, so you need the dark shadows and the bright highlights, but other colours will absolutely help that armour pop. And as you can see here, that white now looks super clean and really nice, especially that shoulder pad. I'm quite pleased with that one. The Mini isn't fully finished, but this is a good example of what a clean white paint job can look like. Now here's the really quick way to do white armour, and it involves a lot of battle damage. You can essentially skip all the stages that involved glazing and edge highlighting and just go straight in with the panel liner. For more details, I painted a white scar on a jet bike in the top right and you should check it out, but essentially you base coat all your colours, Then you do all this chipping that I'm doing here using a handy dandy contraption with a clip and some Rhinox hide on a sponge. And then your final step is to add that panel liner, which really creates a nice gradient between everything. For extra points, you don't even need to gloss varnish. And if you do all that, you'll end up with something that looks a little bit more like this. As you can see, it's still very obviously white armor, but much more battle damaged. I also like to add a bunch of streaks using Agaros dunes, but you can use enamel paints, whatever you like here. Another cool thing to add is a whole bunch of pigments. White paint takes pigment really well. Now, I didn't film myself applying the pigment powder that I used, but essentially you just take a clean, dry brush and a bunch of pigment powder. In this case, I used Abteilung 502's Vietnam Earth, and you jab it all over the legs of the model to tie it into the base. I have shown this method in other videos, so do feel free to check those out. But with that, our model will be complete. A nice battle damaged white scar that's probably taken half the time of the clean version, even though I did it over the clean version. Here's a quick peek of what the legs look like after the pigment powder, and I hope that's been at least somewhat helpful in the quest to paint white armor. Make sure you go check out Midwinter Mini's video on painting yellow. I hope you enjoyed this video. I've been Sam. See you next time.